We're going to be in Psalm 3 this morning, if you'd like to turn there with me. Psalm 3, we'll also have it up on the projectors. Oh, projectors, man. I'm remembering slideshow projectors from when I was a kid. Anyway, thanks for that quick moment of nostalgia. I want to tell you a story about a guy named Willem. It was the late 1800s. Willem was 25 years old, and he was being ordained into the denomination in which his father had served as a minister before him in the Netherlands. Willem was sent to a small town in the south of Belgium, a coal mining town. And in his first weeks and months, the people felt pretty good about him. There are quotes saying, he seemed like he cared about us. He seemed like he genuinely was interested in us as people. But the real test came a few months in when there was a mine collapse. A number of people were trapped, the town was thrown into chaos, and Willem jumped in with both feet. He started trying to organize efforts to feed the families of those who were trapped in the mine and the workers who were going in to try to rescue them. He took care of the wounded as they were pulled back out, helping as a nurse. He even at times was said to have gone to the slag piles outside of the mine to try and find burnable material to keep the homes of the community heated through the winter. One person said that Willem became the picture of Jesus to the community. They called him the Christ of the coal mines. And as the people realized that he loved them, he cared for them, Willem's ministry flourished. The small red brick church in the corner of the village was packed out on Sundays as the people said they heard about the love of Jesus from this person who was showing them the love of Jesus. A few months later, a denominational official came to visit and was shocked at what he found. See, Willem was living in abject poverty. His pants were sewn together out of old flour sacks that were sent to the town. The place he was living probably couldn't be called more than a hut or a hovel on the edges of town. And the official said, Willem, what are you doing? What is this madness? What has happened to the salary that we sent you, the support for the church? And Willem told them simply, I gave it to the miners. We're going through a disaster. They needed help. Well, depending on who you listen to, what happened next was either because denominational officials were worried that Willem would literally kill himself in service to the community, or because they were a little bit worried that his particular brand of devotion would make their level of financial affluence look out of touch. But either way, Willem was removed from his position as the pastor of the church. Willem didn't want to leave the community. He had grown to love it, and so he stayed there, working odd jobs, trying to make ends meet, and he was there for a few months. The weeks and months that followed were characterized by despair and sadness and just confusion. Willem felt that he had had a call on his life, that he was supposed to bring some of God's beauty into the lives of these coal miners while also dignifying the work and the duty that they felt towards their families and their profession and each other. One day, as he was eating his lunch months later, Willem saw a man, an elderly mine worker, walking along the road on the other side of the street carrying a bag of coal. It was something that happened hundreds of times a day, but for some reason, in that moment, Willem was struck by the contrast between the weariness of the worker and his faithfulness to what he was called to do. And he wanted to capture that in some way, shape, or form. And so Willem pulled out an envelope and a charcoal stub that he had in his pocket, and he started trying to sketch this man walking along the other side of the street to in some small way, capture that moment. And he got to the end hours later, and it stunk. He felt like he had completely failed to capture what he was trying to capture, and so he tried again. He turned the envelope over. He tried on the other side. He ripped the envelope up. He opened the inside and started drawing on that. He went home, and for hours throughout the night by lamplight, he tried and tried and tried to capture this scene. And he didn't get better at it overnight, but he did get better over years. And he started leaning more and more into a calling that he felt on his life to bring some of God's beauty into the lives of these miners and everyday folks that he was working with, while also dignifying who they were as people and the work that God had called them to. We remember him today as Vincent Willem van Gogh. There we go. There are certain pieces of art that you just can't see the full picture until you know the story behind it. And so today, we're going to be reading and learning about Psalm 3. But in order to do so rightly, we have to look in both broad strokes and specific notes at the story of what was happening when this psalm was written. Right at the beginning of Psalm 3, we find words that says, "A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son." That's not a subject heading. It's not something we added to the Bible to help you know some more context about the psalm. It's actually part of the original biblical text. They want us to know when this was written and what was going on. So I'm going to try to give you a brief backstory this morning to help you know where are we in the story of David and his son Absalom when this psalm starts, when we hit verse 1. So I'd love to give you every detail, but that's a lecture series and not a sermon. So in the immortal words of the Princess Bride, let me explain. No, there's too much. Let me sum up. So I'm going to try to sum up a few chapters here to catch you up with what's going on with David and his son Absalom. David is the greatest king in Israel's history. For thousands of years after, when the Israelites say, we want a king like, the name that follows is going to be David. We want a king like David. But that doesn't mean he's perfect. He's a human being, and in fact, he has some pretty major mistakes and sins in his life. One of them being that he gives in to a lust, both physically and for power, through connections to other kingdoms, that leads him to marrying many, many wives and having concubines as well. Through those relationships and through all the half-sibling children that he has through those, there becomes this story of rivalry and even hatred amongst his children. Absalom was seen as one of the favorites for the throne when David eventually died. He is characterized as being very handsome, very good-looking, very politically apt. He was the one who looked like a king was supposed to look. And so a lot of David's closest advisors, including some of his military advisors, wanted Absalom to be king when David died. But there was a problem. See, years before, Absalom had been exiled from Israel because he killed his half-brother Amnon when his half-brother Amnon raped his full sister Tamar. It's a nasty story. There's a lot that goes sideways in David's genealogy because of his falling to this idolatry, this lust, this power that he's going after. Anyway, as David gets older and his succession becomes more and more of a pressing concern in the minds of his advisors, David is manipulated and pressured to bring Absalom back from exile. And so he does. Absalom decides he's not willing to wait and find out who David is going to make king when he dies. He wants to be king now. And so Absalom begins consolidating power. He starts putting himself in positions to gain influence among the people and their leaders. And for 4 years, he gathers this support until eventually he consummates his conspiracy, gathers those who would support him, and begins a coup against David. David hears and finds out what's happening, that Absalom's army, his group of followers, are converging on Jerusalem, and he is forced to flee out of Jerusalem and down to the Jordan River. And that is where we pick up in Psalm 3 this morning. David has been forced to flee the city. His son is rising against him. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 in Psalm 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. David is realizing the depth of conspiracy against him. Many are rising against me. We see this in the story as he leaves Jerusalem, pushed out into the countryside by the advance of Absalom's oncoming army. David begins receiving a cavalcade of bad news bearers. It's kind of like a smaller version of the beginning of the book of Job that Krishan talked about last week, where it's just bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news over and over. As he leaves the city, 2 Samuel 15:30 tells the story. It says, 2 Samuel 15:30, but David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up weeping as they went. And it was told to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Ahithophel, beyond having one of the super fun to pronounce names in the Bible, Ahithophel was one of David's longtime trusted advisors. This is your mentor, your oldest friend, someone that you go to for help in times of trouble. I'm at the age and have been in ministry long enough now at this point to start being in this position for some young married couples and college students that I've mentored over the years. And this is as if I, in their time of need, turned on them and attacked them instead. I went with the people who were rising against them. This is, as one of the passages put it a few weeks ago, being treacherous without cause. Ahithophel didn't complain about anything. He didn't come to David years before and say, "David, I don't like your foreign policy here. I'm really starting to feel like we need a change in leadership." He didn't come and say, "David, you need to do this differently." He just all of a sudden shows up with the enemy. And he just stabs him in the back. So that's one blow that David takes. But then, as he crosses the summit of the mountain, on the other side, 2 Samuel says that the manager of the household of Mephibosheth meets David. We have the fun names Calvary this morning. Maybe you know Mephibosheth, maybe you don't. But Mephibosheth was paralyzed. He was probably, in our modern parlance, a paraplegic. And he was the only living son of Jonathan, David's best friend, the son of King Saul, who had died with Saul in battle with the Philistines. In the ancient Near East, the area that Israel was in, if you became king and you were not of the line of the old king, you had one thing that was order of the day number one. What do you think that is? You round up the old king's family and you kill all of them. That was any time a new king was taken over. If you weren't part of the family of the old king, act number one of your official reign was you gather their family, you kill them all, you move on with life. It wasn't personal, it was business. That's the risk that you took as a member of a royal family in exchange for your position of great privilege. You had to know that if your family fell out of power, you would die. But David doesn't do that. When David comes to the throne, he seeks out Mephibosheth, the last living member of King Saul's direct household and lineage, to show kindness to him and love. He goes to him, he says, "I loved your father, he was like my brother, and I want you to be like one of my sons. I want you to be considered a part of my household. I want you to eat at my table. I want to make sure that you lack for nothing for the rest of your life." And here comes the manager of Mephibosheth's household, kind of the head of his servants, of the people who worked for him. Ziba. He was an elderly servant who had been one of King Saul's servants. And Ziba comes bearing food and provisions and donkeys and mules and horses for people to ride on. This is great. Certainly, this is a balm in time of trouble. This is a reminder and a repayment of the good that David did out of his selflessness in providing for Mephibosheth all these years, in saving him from possible... Wait a second. As we read through the chapter, we go, wait, where's Mephibosheth? Well, it's the head of his household, but Mephibosheth isn't here. What's going on right now? And then David asks a question in 2 Samuel 16:3. What happened to him? What's going on? The king says, "Where is your master's son? Where's Mephibosheth?" And Ziba says to the king, "Behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father.'" In repayment of David's kindness, Mephibosheth foolishly, we can say looking from the outside in, but for some reason Mephibosheth foolishly seems to be planning to use chaos as a ladder to climb back into the throne that God had given to David. Again, David says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me." And then he says, "Many are saying of me, there is no salvation for him in God." As David is leaving Jerusalem, two priests, Abiathar and Zadok, come up to him. They run up bearing the Ark of the Covenant, in which were kept the symbols of God's goodness to the people of Israel. There was a jar of manna from their time in the wilderness. There was Aaron's staff that had bloomed to show God's faithfulness. There was the tablets with the Ten Commandments on them. And they come up bearing the Ark of the Covenant. They basically say, "David, we're going to go with you. You're the king. The ark goes with you. We'll go with you out into the wilderness." And David says no. In 2 Samuel 15:25, it says, "Then the king said to Zadok, 'Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place.'" And I'm going to read verse 26 as well. "But if he says, 'I have no pleasure in you,' behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him. If I find favor." See, there were many saying of David, there is no salvation for him. Basically, God has abandoned him because of what's going on. Absalom was saying it in his rebellion. His allies were saying it in their disloyalty. Mephibosheth and Ahithophel were saying it by their betrayal. But there was one other voice who wasn't necessarily stating it as a fact. He was more asking it as a question. Is there salvation for me in God? And that was David. As David is pushed out into the wilderness, we see him as he ponders and processes what is happening in his life. David questions whether God's going to pull him out of the fire this time. Maybe you've felt like this at some point recently. You've lost a family member, a job, a relationship, or a dream. Or maybe it's because of what's going on around you in life, in our country, our state, in your family, etc. And you've said, is there salvation in God? So let's keep reading and see what David's response is, even in the midst of all that's going on in chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill." Even as his heart questions, even as he acknowledges the hardship of his situation, David proclaims that the Lord is a shield about him, that God is his glory, the one who lifts his head. It's an image for he's lifting me up out of sorrow, out of ashes, out of brokenness, out of despair. He is the one who lifts me up. There's an interesting thing that happens to David as he flees Jerusalem in that next chapter. A man, a distant relative of King Saul, a member of his tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, he starts running alongside the road. So David and his people are down on the road, and he starts running alongside the road up on a hill, and he starts cussing out David and the rest of the people. That sounds like a joke. It's definitely not. If we were trying to keep things PG and we were hearing what he was yelling, we would be bleeping out every third or fourth word. But at one point in his cussing, his swearing, his cursing, he takes time and he yells out a specific curse. He says, David is a man of blood, and that the betrayal of his son against him is God's vengeance for what David did to the house of Saul. At this point, David's lieutenants can't take it anymore. They start pulling swords and bows and say, David, can you just let us kill this guy already? Come on, man. We got target practice. He's 40 feet away. We can do this. Can you please let us kill? And David says, no. Again, totally out of character. If David was your normal conquering king, David says, no, do not kill him. In fact, David says, God will judge between us. And if I am innocent of this man's charges, perhaps God will turn those curses into blessings in some way, shape, or form. it's so strange because in some ways the man's curses are the absolute opposite of David's character. I mean, remember, we already heard about what David did for Mephibosheth. He says, no, King Saul's household is holy. But if we think back to earlier in David's life, David didn't kill Saul when he had the chance, even when Saul was actively trying to murder him. When Saul dies and David takes over the throne, a man comes to David and says, I am the one who killed Saul. He thinks he's going to get rewarded. And David has the guy executed. He says, you don't kill God's king. No. When Saul's son Ishbosheth tries to take over half of Israel, someone goes and assassinates him, and David punishes them for trying to secure his reign against the house of Saul. David says, no. All throughout his life, he has tried to preserve the house of Saul, to love him, to care for him, and for those who are connected to him. So imagine this. In the worst moment of your life, you are verbally attacked by this person accusing you of crazy, out there, off-the-wall stuff. What is your response? And I think the natural human response is there's three of them. The first is, I wake up and choose violence. Whether physical or verbal, I am striking back. I am beating this guy up. I am making those accusations go away. The second, also violent, but self-defensive. I'm going to prove that he's wrong. I'm going to take out those accusations. I'm going to show who I am as a person. And the third, on the other side of the spectrum, is despair. This is already the worst moment of my life. How is this going to get worse? I'm going to lay down and die now. Thanks a lot. Those are kind of the natural human responses, but David, both in the moment and later as he writes the psalm, says, God is the shield about me. He is my glory. He is the one who lifts my head, and I don't have to defend myself against these false accusations. David's response is a faith that allows him to persevere without punching back. And his trust in the Lord is so clear in that last line. He said, David says, the Lord is my God. Excuse me, I got to turn over to this here. The Lord is my God. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me. Does anybody remember where he was answered from? David says, the Lord answered me from... Anybody remember? Okay, so yeah, his holy hill. Where is his holy hill? It's Jerusalem, where David is actively running from. It's about to be taken by his enemies, and David says, if God wants to answer, he will answer from his holy hill. David says, all of these earthly circumstances that are arrayed against me don't matter for squat if God is on my side, and I'm going to let him be the one who answers this. And so finally, after David in faith absorbs the jeers and curses of his opponents and says, if God will, he will turn those into blessings, finally David arrives at the Jordan River. And in 2 Samuel 16:14, we read, and the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. And the psalm has two verses that are basically directly about that part of 2 Samuel, where he is at the river, he is resting overnight, he is refreshing himself. So let's read verses 5 and 6. David says, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. David believes. David has faith. David credits any good thing that happens to him as being from God. He says, I woke again because the Lord sustained me. Not because I'm so great, not because I'm so moral, not because I chose my friends well, not because I was smart enough to get out fast, not because of any of those things. He says, I woke up today because God sustained me. I woke up today because God said it was going to be so, and he loves me and he cares about me. Friends, you woke up today because God sustains you. I woke up today because God sustains me. We have had a number of medical emergencies amongst us as the family of Christ in recent months and even the last few days. And one of my prayers when those happen is that they will remind us all As Krishan reminds us as he prays for us before his sermons, that the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord stands forever. I pray that it will remind us that we are a mist that appears for a little time and vanishes. That in our perishable bodies we are fleeting, but that we believe in a God who has come that we might put on imperishable bodies, that we might have eternal life as the New Testament talks about it. We believe in a God who can sustain us even after death. That for the Christian, death is not a period, it is a comma. And David says, that comma in my life has not come yet because the Lord has chosen to sustain me. And if that is the case, if God be for me, who can be against me? Again, verse 6 says, I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. If God be for me, who can be against me? And yet, we do still have enemies in life. We do still have struggles to face. We have forces arrayed against us that would pull us away from the joy of the Lord and seek to destroy us and our faith in Him. So what are we to do about that? What was David to do? And we find here at the end of our psalm and the end of our story a holy paradox, a divine dilemma, a place where we see so clearly that our God is a God of justice and that our God is a God of mercy. In Psalm 3:7, we read, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked." Indeed, they are break the teeth of the wicked. Our teeth, in poetic language, the teeth of the wicked is kind of a symbol of their ability to attack, their ability to destroy. Think about when you have one of those giant turkey legs from the Ren Fair, and you just go, and rip a big chunk off. That's the image there for the teeth of the wicked. It's tearing, it's ripping, it's attacking. And so breaking the teeth of the wicked means destroying their ability to cause harm, to inflict pain, to rend flesh of their enemies. And this is exactly what we see God doing over the next few chapters of David's story. As he spends a short time in exile, Absalom absolutely messes up every single way that he can. Absalom listens to his advisors when they give him bad advice, and he ignores them when they give him good advice. He tries to show that he now owns what was his father's by raping the concubines left to keep watch over the palace, turning the hearts of the people in some ways against him, showing them that he is not the person they thought he was. He fails to press his military advantage against David because he becomes inexplicably cowardly and afraid of David's small group of exiles. He starts alienating his friends and allies. Ahithophel actually gets so ashamed by Absalom's decisions that he gets on his donkey, goes home, sets his affairs in order, and commits suicide. Absalom, again, nasty story. Absalom, through some divine combination of his own foolishness and God's judgment, absolutely fumbles his short time as acting king of Israel. He finally gathers his forces and pursues David across the Jordan River. But by then, those loyal to David had reorganized an army to protect him and were ready to fight back. David sends the army out to do battle with the army of Absalom that is crossing the river. But he gives orders to his generals to deal gently with Absalom, to capture him but not kill him. Absalom continues to make terrible choices. He chooses to fight on the wrong ground. So important in battles of those days. If you are perhaps maybe a Civil War historian or something, the terrain, the territory. Absalom chooses a terrible place to fight. He goes into a forest on the other side of the river, and the Bible says that the forest ends up killing more people than the armies did on that day. I could here insert a great Lord of the Rings reference about the forest of Fangorn, which killed the remnants of the Uruk-hai army after the Battle of Helm's Deep, but I'll spare you. Anyway, I'm trying to get the brownie points from not doing the illustration while still doing it. In the midst of the battle, we read in the Bible that Absalom gets stuck in a tree. See, you might remember from his original description that Absalom was considered very handsome. And apparently a big part of that was his long flowing Fabio hair. There we go. This is my mental image of Absalom and has been for years. Somebody who's very good looking, very long hair, maybe not much going on under that hair, but he looked the part for sure. Well, Absalom rides through the forest on his mount, and there's a tangled branch, and his hair gets caught in it. He gets ripped off of his horse, and he's left hanging there, unable to get to the ground, unable to free himself, symbolically captured by his own pride and vanity. David's men find him. They send word to one of the generals, who comes and, what do you think the general does? He kills him. He's not having this mercy stuff. Deal gently with my son. He tried to kill you. He tried to take your throne. The general kills him. And that is what Absalom deserved for his evil. In a lot of ways, that's the just way for the story to end. And that could be the end of the story. But it's not, which is really interesting. See, the psalm and the story in 2 Samuel keep going. In the psalm, we find verse 8 after verse 7. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. After the judgment of the wicked in verse 7, we get the salvation of God and a blessing on his people in verse 8. And after Absalom's death in 2 Samuel, we find a messenger, a young Cushite, running to bring the news to the king in 2 Samuel 18:32 and 33. Excuse me again. The Cushite runs up, and the king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." Again, he's excited about the judgment. He's in verse 7 of the psalm. They break the teeth of the wicked. Yeah, knock them down, take them out. David, this is what should happen to everyone who goes against you. But this is what David says. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." And then, as if that wasn't enough, we get chapter 19, in which David pardons all of those who had rebelled against him. He pardons the man who walked along the road cursing and cussing him out. He pardons Mephibosheth for his betrayal in the moment of fire and of heat and of confusion. He pardons those who had been part of Absalom's army who had retreated away. We see David as a king who conquers his enemies but loves them at the same time. We see David as a king who trusts in God in the hardest moments of his life and continues depending upon him in all things. We see David as a king who wishes he could give his life to take the place of his rebellious children. And this is where we realize that we're not talking about David anymore. This is where we as Christians get this peek behind the curtain that wasn't always there, because we realize we're not talking about David anymore, we're talking about Jesus. Because David said, "Would that I could have died instead of you." And Jesus says, "I will die instead of you." And we realize that in this story, we aren't David, we are Absalom. We are the children who in our selfishness and pride are constantly tempted to put ourselves on our Father's throne, to be the rulers of our own lives. We are the ones who listen to the wrong voices around us and end up making terrible decisions. We are the ones who choose the wrong battles to fight and end up fighting the wrong enemies in the first place. We are the ones who become captives of our own pride and vanity. And we, Absaloms, all of us, look to our Father, who should by justice order our deaths, who should be like the general, like the Cushite. Yes, verse 7, may this happen to everyone who goes against you. And our Father says, deal gently with my child. He says that He wants us to turn to Him out of our rebellion, that in Him we can find a shield about us, that He will be our glory and the lifter of our heads. He reminds us that both verse 7 and verse 8 are true at the same time, that we are the wicked, the enemies of God, that we deserve to be struck down, but that in the economy of mercy that God gives us, we are also the people of God. The New Testament tells us that explicitly in 1 Peter 2:10 when it says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. We, the wicked and the rebels, have an open invite to become the people of God by believing that we have a Savior, that salvation comes from the Lord, that we have a Father who said, my son, my daughter, I will die instead of you.